Hey everybody, welcome back to Engaging the Phenomenon. Today's talk is on the history of Tom DeLonge and Dr. Steven Greer. Now this is both an interesting and important relationship and connection, which I'll go over because it's going to show you from where the disclosure project or the disclosure process was back then in the early 90s and where it is now at To the Stars Academy. Now, Tom DeLonge, we all know from a very young age, was very passionate about UFOs. So in the late 90s, he ended up coming across Dr. Greer's work, and somewhere in the late 90s and early 2000s, he actually met up with Dr. Steven Greer. He called him, he got connected with him. He actually went out to a CE5 expedition with Dr. Greer, and in Dr. Greer's book, Contact Countdown to Transformation, it talks about or references Blink 182 members attending a CE5 expedition. Now, this is important because back in those days, Tom DeLonge had been spending time around Dr. Greer.
So we drive out to the desert and we had all of our stuff. And at the time, I was hanging out with Steven Greer, Dr. Steven Greer, which is controversial. It was fantastic for me. And that, maybe I should start the story there. And when Blink was first popping, I realized quickly that I can pretty much call anyone and get them on the phone. So I called up Dr. Greer's office and I got them on the phone. I said, hey, I want to talk to you about UFOs and stuff. And so he's right on. So I flew him and his daughters out to some show, bought their plane tickets, got them out there. And then I'm about ready to go on stage. There's like an arena. There's like 10,000 some people waiting, cheering, and I'm back with him. I'm okay. I'm walking to the stage, but we're stopping. I'm trying to get as much information as I could out of him. And we kindled that relationship, over a while. And I flew a producer from MTV. Back in the day, they had a show called MTV Diary, and the guy that created that show, I flew him out to Greer's ranch and got into a bunch of stuff. At the time, Greer was doing the disclosure project. No one had these tapes of all these witnesses. He had 100 hours of it, but he edited it down to 36 hours or something. And I was the first person he gave the tapes to. He would never leave this backpack. It was really rad. It was like a spy movie or some shit. And I'm like on tour. I'm like, I thought it was awesome. So he gave me all these tapes, and I'm like, fuck. I guess I'll hide them in my house somewhere. CIA will never find these. My phones got weird at that moment. So as soon as I started hanging out with Greer, got these tapes, and started flying him and Dr. Carol Rosin out to the LA, which was funny too, because I'm at this big agency called Creative Artists Agency, which is like, they represent Tom Cruise and shit. Mm-hmm. And so I have all these agents at this round table, and I bring in this chick with crazy hair, and I bring in Greer, and all these people are at this table, and they're like, and I sit them down, I said, I want you to hear this, and they just start going off, super dramatic and serious. Greer, he just gets into his thing, really eloquent, and just sets the stage with all these people at the table. And they were like, what the fuck is going on? They didn't quite, all these Hollywood agents were like totally baffled at this whole experience, and they walked out of the room not even knowing what to do with the information or anything. It didn't really go anywhere.
And obviously Dr. Greer was communicating with him, probably on somewhat deep levels, because Tom DeLonge, talks about in an interview actually having the original Disclosure Project witness testimony, which was at least 30 hours on VHSs, and Dr. Greer had entrusted Tom DeLonge with holding the copies of this Disclosure Project witness testimony, which Dr. Greer didn't just give out to anybody. It's also important because it's probably fair to assume that Tom DeLonge got to see firsthand how Dr. Greer operated, how Dr. Greer was speaking with all these insiders and connecting those insiders with each other, and that was propelling Dr. Greer forward to what eventually became the Disclosure Project in 2001, but started in 1991 with CSETI and Project Starlight, and along the way was involved with what's called the Rockefeller Initiative, which of course Dr. Greer, Edgar Mitchell, Will Miller, and other Disclosure Project witnesses had conferences and meetings. They briefed the Clintons at Lawrence Rockefeller's ranch, and John Podesta was also around for that time, and I'm not sure if John Podesta had an interest before that, but at that time John Podesta was able to get that information on all the Disclosure Project witness testimony and everything that went along with that. And again, we know that John Podesta was working with and helping Tom DeLonge in the at least 2015-2016 time, and that was outed by WikiLeaks when John Podesta's email got hacked, and they had all these communications with Tom DeLonge, General McCaslin, and other high-ranking officials, and which worked down, maybe in pros and cons for Tom DeLonge, because everybody realized at that point he wasn't messing around and just saying random stuff, that he did have real insiders and advisors. Whether you think he's being misled or not, he did have people really deep in the intelligence and military network that dealt with UFOs. And again, this connection goes back to the 90s with Dr. Greer and the Clintons and Podesta, Project Starlight, and the Disclosure Project, which went forward to lay down the groundwork for everything we're seeing today, in a way. The Disclosure, again, Project Starlight started in the early 90s. It developed with people meeting, conferences, people coming forward as witnesses. In 2001, it culminated as the Disclosure Project, and that laid down a groundwork and layout for disclosure conferences at the National Press Club Conference, because after the May 9th, 2001 National Press Club Conference with Dr. Greer and others, which is now known as the Disclosure Project, even that next year in 2002, John Podesta is at the National Press Club for UFO Disclosure Conference, and he actually gives a small speech.
I think it's time to open the books on questions that have remained in the dark, on the question of government investigations of UFOs. It's time to find out what the truth really is that's out there. We ought to do it really because it's right. We ought to do it because the American people, quite frankly, can handle the truth. And we ought to do it because it's the law.
And John Podesta actually went forward to write a small segment for Leslie Kean's book. And of course, we know Leslie Kean was one of the Pulitzer Prize winning authors of the New York Times story that broke the ATIP story and the U.S. government's UFO program, the first one known since allegedly in 1969, when Project Blue Book ended. And the U.S. government said, we have no further involvement with UFOs, which we all know that was nonsense, but now we have the actual proof, thanks to Luis Elizondo and Tom DeLonge, and to the Stars Academy. And again, Leslie Kean, Ralph Blumenthal, Helena Cooper, and New York Times kind of pushing that story out. And we know that Luis and Chris Mellon were, helped get those videos out, especially Luis Elizondo, and that really propelled to the Stars Academy to new grounds, no doubt, and the entire UFO disclosure process and subject. And I would argue that we would not have all this to the Stars Academy, even though Luis Elizondo played a key role in having this happen. We might not have had all this occur without the original foundations of Project Starlight and the Disclosure Project and everything that happened back in the early 90s, which was not just Dr. Greer. Dr. Edgar Mitchell, Willard Miller, Commander Will Miller, Robert Salas, and Hal Puthoff was actually involved in those days, associated with a Disclosure Project. I'm not sure you can say he he was part of it, but he was associated with it. He was a Disclosure Project witness, and now he's a To the Stars Academy member. You know, he's one of the main team members at To the Stars Academy. So you can see how, you know, everything that happened back then in the 90s and to the 2000, and that led up to the X conferences where there were subsequent National Press Club conference disclosure conferences, basically, to the 2001 where Podesta talked at, and there were several after that. And then one of the really notable ones was in 2010 with Robert Hastings, UFOs and Nukes. Again, those were all Disclosure Project witnesses. Many of them were Disclosure Project witnesses. Maybe Robert Hastings would have been able to pull that off without all that. But again, if you look at a lot of the witnesses that were involved somehow in the Disclosure Project, and the Disclosure Project had laid the groundwork for those kind of National Press Club events to occur. And then again, you had the citizens hearing for disclosure, which was another big push. So all this momentum started back then, and you had the subsequent National Press Club events. They all propelled a very significant momentum, although at the time they were big for the UFO community. Mainstream media, they reported on it very mildly. The UFOs and Nukes one got a little more attention, and again, Citizens Hearing got a little more attention. But then here comes To the Stars in 2014, 2015 more so, and which developed into To the Stars Academy when Tom got these new advisors, which is Elizondo came on board, Steve Justice, Jim Semivan, and those guys. But again, I think Dr. Greer and his relationship with Tom DeLonge really helped put that all together in one way or another, because Tom DeLonge again saw how Dr. Greer was able to operate. He saw it was possible to speak to these insiders. He saw it was possible to kind of get these people in different programs speaking to each other and start making moves and start making things happen. Now, I do think 2016, 2017, 2018, the time is much more ripe, and it is because of those past meetings and conferences and witnesses speaking to each other and all the momentum from that we have To the Stars Academy being able to pull off what they did. I think that this 1990s era, Tom DeLonge and Dr. Greer, everything that was involved with that is crucial for what occurred today and is occurring, because a huge momentum was built up over the last 20 years because of everything that happened. And Tom DeLonge was able to make almost what you would call a Disclosure Project 2.0, or maybe even 3.0, right? It's something new. You know, nowadays we have social media, so Tom DeLonge is able to utilize social media to promote the work and get people involved. And it's a different spin. It's a different day and age, but in many ways it is similar to the Disclosure Project. It's just revamped, rethought out. There is an obvious different approach with Dr. Greer focusing more on positive ET encounters and the utopian post-disclosure world, where Tom does have a similar sentiment in a more utopian post-disclosure world, but there's the UFO threat narrative that's involved with that is not in Dr. Greer's. And there's a lot of controversy over that, but that's not what this video is for, even though I will be touching on that in later videos. But I do think it is important to note that Dr. Greer and Tom DeLonge have a history, and is likely everything happening today actually started back in those days, and that Dr. Greer and Tom DeLonge meeting and being around each other and actually having somewhat of a relationship for whatever period of time is important to what we're seeing roll out today, because it is in many ways, To the Stars Academy is in many ways a continuation of the Disclosure Project. And at the time, the Disclosure Project did take things further, but only up to such a point. And now To the Stars Academy has basically revamped it and have taken it up a level or two, and was able to accomplish things that the Disclosure Project was not able to at that time. So all this, I think, is important history. I think that, again, that this is an important topic. I think that people need to recognize this. Grant Cameron did do did touch on this a little bit in his book Managing Magic, which he discusses people like William Moore, Steven Greer, Tom DeLonge, and what he calls the UFO messiahs, and how you had these government insiders working with people in the public to do some kind of a disclosure movement, except now we're in a whole new ball game, and we'll see where we go from here.